The evening my brother-in-law told the hotel's banquet manager that my mother wasn't a seated guest. She was wearing the navy blazer she'd saved for important occasions since the mid-90s. She'd ironed it herself that morning. I know because I called her at 8 a.m. and heard the iron hissing in the background. My name is Ray Colbert. I'm 44 years old. I drive a service van for an electrical contracting company in Mississauga, and I have what my wife calls the useful skill of being able to sit very still in rooms where other people are coming apart. I got that from my mother, Dorothy Colbert, who spent 36 years as a registered nurse at Hamilton General Hospital and learned to stay calm in situations that would reduce most people to their knees. That Thursday evening in November, we were gathered at the Elgin Court Hotel in downtown Hamilton for what my sister Karen had billed. In the group chat, in the printed invitations, in 3 separate phone calls to relatives across Ontario as a retirement for our mother. 36 years. 3 department head positions. 2 provincial nursing excellence awards that sat in a box in her hall closet, because Dorothy wasn't much for hanging certificates where company could see them. The hotel had a private dining room on the 2nd floor with windows looking out over the escarpment, and my brother-in-law Brad had made the reservation. That last part mattered more than I understood at the time. Brad Whitmore is 41 years old, a commercial real estate broker, the kind who wears blazers that fit precisely and talks about square footage the way other people talk about their children. He married my sister Karen 8 years ago, and for the first couple of years, he seemed to genuinely try. He came to family dinners. He asked my mother questions about her career that sounded like he actually wanted the answers. He laughed at her jokes, the real laugh, not the polite one. Somewhere around year 3, something shifted. I noticed it first at Christmas. Brad had started answering my mother's questions with single sentences and then finding his phone. Not rude enough to name, just enough to communicate that her presence wasn't something he was actively enjoying. By year 5, he'd developed a habit at family gatherings of speaking about Dorothy, as though she were slightly out of earshot, even when she was sitting right there. My sister noticed. I could tell by the way she'd redirect conversations, smooth things over, fill silences that Brad created. She loved him. I don't think she wanted to see it clearly. My mother never said a word about any of it. Dorothy has this quality. I've watched it my whole life, where she simply absorbs a room's discomfort and keeps moving. A doctor dresses her down in front of patients. She finishes the task at hand. A family member forgets her birthday 2 years running. She sends them a card on theirs. She doesn't perform dignity. She just has it the way some people are born left-handed. It's simply how they're built. She'd been looking forward to this dinner for weeks. I knew because she called me the Friday before to ask what she should wear. Not something she usually did. She wanted to look right for the occasion, she said. "You always look right," I told her. She laughed. "That's your job, Ray. Your actual job tonight is to eat whatever they put in front of you without complaint." "That's also my job at home," I said. She laughed harder. I arrived early, stood in the lobby near the front desk, and watched her come through the hotel's glass doors in that navy blazer with the pearl earrings, and I thought, 36 years. She gave them 36 years, and she still ironed the blazer herself this morning. Brad and Karen were already in the private dining room when the hostess walked us up. Brad had his jacket on the back of his chair and a glass of wine going before we'd settled in. The table was set for 8. My mother's friend Luan Garvey, 68, a retired teacher from the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, my cousin Terrence and his husband Paul, and Brad's colleague Glenn, who'd apparently come along to fill 2 seats after Karen's friends canceled last minute. My mother sat down and immediately asked Glenn about his kids by name, because Karen had mentioned them once, and Dorothy had retained the detail. That's the kind of person she is. She keeps what people think nobody bothers to keep. The hotel's banquet coordinator came up about 20 minutes in to confirm the dinner service. Her name was Sheila, late 20s, efficient, clearly good at her job. She worked through the meal confirmations around the table. Standard stuff. When she reached my mother and started noting her preference, Brad spoke up. He didn't shout. That wasn't his way. Brad was the kind of man who delivered a cut at a volume nobody could accuse him of. He leaned slightly forward and said, with the particular tone of someone correcting a clerical error, "Actually, she's not on the dinner reservation. She's joining us for the drinks portion." Sheila blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Dorothy." He said her name the way you'd say an item you wanted removed from a bill. She wasn't included in the seated dinner booking. The per head package is set. It's just cocktails for her. The table went quiet. Not all at once. It rippled out from where Brad was sitting, the way quiet always does when something wrong has been said in public. My mother put her hands in her lap. Karen said quickly, "Brad." "It's fine," my mother said. Her voice was entirely level. "I can order something from—" "It's not really about ordering," Brad said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "The package was set up in advance. I just don't think it makes sense to add to a per-person booking last minute. I want you to sit with that for a moment." The dinner was for my mother's retirement. The invitations Karen sent, the ones Dorothy had kept on her refrigerator under a Hamilton Tiger Cats magnet, said, "Please join us to celebrate Dorothy Colbert's 36 years of dedicated nursing service." That was the woman Brad had just told the hotel staff wasn't a seated guest at her own dinner. I set down my fork. I'm not a man who makes scenes in restaurants. I understood early that the people who shout in these moments hand the other person something to push back against. You raise your voice and you become the problem. You stay quiet and the problem stays exactly where it is, in full light, visible to everyone. So I stayed quiet. I picked my fork back up. I kept eating the bread roll I'd been working on, and I did not look at Brad, and I did not look at my mother, because I knew that if I looked at her in that moment, I would not be able to keep eating bread. My cousin Terrence caught my eye across the table. He gave me the look I'd known since we were kids. "I see it. I'm watching what you do." I gave him a small nod. "Not yet, Ned." What Brad didn't know, what Karen didn't fully know either, not all of it, was something I'd only come to understand in pieces over the years. Dorothy was not a woman who talked about money or about what she'd done for people. She lived in the same East End Hamilton bungalow she and my father had bought in 1987. She'd driven the same Civic for 11 years. She made her own lunches every day and considered dinner at the Mandarin a genuine occasion. What she also did quietly was give. Not loudly. Not in ways that got her name on anything. She'd sat on the volunteer committee for the hospital's patient support fund for 12 years. When a young personal support worker on her unit got into a nursing program at Mohawk College but couldn't manage the first semester's tuition, Dorothy wrote a check and didn't mention it again. When a patient's family couldn't arrange safe discharge, no car, no nearby relatives, a second-floor apartment, Dorothy organized the volunteers herself and made 2 of the drives personally. She never told me about most of it. I heard it from other people, the way you hear about things that happen when someone isn't looking for credit. Small threads over years that I'd been collecting without quite knowing I was collecting them. There was one thread I hadn't yet seen the full shape of. I saw him coming before my mother did. A man in a dark fitted suit, mid-30s, walking toward our table with the deliberateness of someone who has something specific to say and has already decided how. The hotel staff seemed to recalibrate slightly around him, not performing, just adjusting, the way people do when someone with actual authority moves through a room. He stopped at the head of the table. "Good evening," he said. "I'm Ian Mercer, general manager of the Elgin Court." He wasn't looking at Brad. He wasn't looking at Karen. He was looking at my mother. "Mrs. Colbert," he said, and his voice shifted. Not louder, just warmer. "I'm sorry I didn't come down sooner. I didn't see your name on the reservation until one of my staff flagged it a few minutes ago." My mother looked up, politely puzzled in the way she gets when someone seems to know her and she's working out why. "My mother," Ian said, "is Paulette Mercer. She was a patient on your unit at Hamilton General, about 14 years ago." Something moved across Dorothy's face, recognition, then something softer. "Paulette," she said quietly. "I remember her. She told me what you did," Ian said. "After she came home, the visits you helped organize, the other things." He paused for a moment. "She made me promise that if I ever met you, I was to tell you she's well and that she never forgot." The table was completely still. Ian straightened. He glanced briefly at Sheila, still standing nearby with her notepad. Then he looked, for the first time, at Brad. His voice stayed professional. Warm, even. But something in his eyes had closed off in the particular way of a person who has worked hospitality for 15 years and has seen every shape unkindness takes, and is not going to pretend this version didn't register. "I understand there was some confusion about the dinner arrangements this evening," Ian said. "I've spoken with our team and corrected that. Mrs. Colbert will be seated for the full dinner service as our guest. There's no additional charge, one beat, for anyone at this table, given the occasion." Brad opened his mouth. "I've also asked our kitchen," Ian continued in the same even tone, to prepare a small acknowledgement for Mrs. Colbert at the end of the meal. 36 years is a remarkable career. We don't get the chance to mark that kind of service often enough. He said it gently. He said it the way you'd say something simply true. Brad closed his mouth. Karen's hand had gone still on the tablecloth. Terence had set his glass down. Glenn was studying the bread basket with concentrated interest. My mother said, "That's very kind, thank you." Ian nodded. He held her gaze for one moment longer than was strictly necessary, the look of a man who had been waiting 14 years to say something and had finally found the right room to say it in, and then he excused himself and walked back toward the far end of the dining room. The rest of the dinner was quiet in a particular way, not uncomfortable, more like the silence after a piece of music stops and the room is still deciding what it felt. Brad refilled his wineglass once and asked Glenn something about a commercial listing in Ancaster. He did not look at my mother directly for most of the meal. Dorothy ate her dinner. She talked to Luann about a garden project she'd been putting off. She asked Terence about his new position in Ottawa. She asked me, quietly, whether I'd heard anything from a crew in my building's contract who'd been working up north. Because I'd mentioned them once 2 months ago on a phone call, she'd clearly not filed away as unimportant. At the end of the meal, a young pastry cook came out from the kitchen carrying a small plate with a single candle and a piece of flourless chocolate cake, nothing elaborate. But several kitchen staff had gathered in the dining room doorway, and Ian was with them. And when the plate arrived, he began to clap, and so did they. And then so did everyone at the table, everyone including, after a visible half-second, Brad. My mother laughed, the real one. She looked slightly embarrassed the way she always does when people make a fuss about her, and then she leaned forward and blew out the candle and said, to no one in particular, "Well, I suppose I've earned the cake." She had. Karen called me the next morning. I could tell she'd been crying, though she didn't say so. "I didn't know he was going to do that," she said. "About the dinner." "I know," I said, because I did. I'd seen Karen's face when Brad said it. That wasn't surprise. That was recognition. The particular expression of someone watching a thing they'd been telling themselves wasn't that serious turn out to be exactly that serious in a room full of people. "He says it really was just a booking mix-up," Karen said, "that he didn't mean it the way it came across." "Karen," I said. There was a long pause. "I know," she said, and then she cried properly and I let her, and when she was done she said, "I need to think through some things." I told her to take her time. I told her I loved her. I told her our mother loved her too, and that none of what needed sorting out was going to change that particular fact, regardless of what she decided. I don't know yet the full shape of what Karen figured out. These things take the time they take, and I've never been in the habit of pretending otherwise. What I know is that she showed up at my mother's bungalow 3 days later with 2 bags of groceries from the Fortinos on Barton, and stayed for 4 hours. Dorothy called me that evening and said they'd had a good visit, and didn't tell me anything more about what was said, which was exactly right. Some conversations belonged to the 2 people who had them. Brad didn't call my mother. I heard through Karen that he'd told a few people the hotel manager had overreacted to a simple miscommunication. I heard that and said nothing back to it. That November, my mother spent Thanksgiving with me, my wife, and our 2 kids. She brought a butter tart pie made from a recipe she'd been holding on to since 1978. She helped our youngest with a school project about people who serve communities, and spent 40 minutes explaining what a hospital actually runs on, which turns out to be considerably less messy than most people assume, and considerably more of 1,000 small acts of steadiness from people who show up without asking for anything in return except to be allowed to keep showing up. My daughter asked her, "Grandma, did you ever wish more people knew what you did for them?" Dorothy thought about it for a moment. She put down her fork. "I knew," she said, "that was always enough." I've turned that answer over many times since, about how some people walk into a room needing to be counted, and some people walk into a room and count everyone else, and about how, in my experience, the second kind of person tends to be the only one still standing when the accounting finally comes due. Brad wanted to decide who was worth a seat at the table. As it turned out, he was the only one there who'd never quite earned his.